So is it Emily or is it?
Amy?
Oh,
Amy,
sorry.
Oh, okay, that's fine. No worries.
Sorry. So hi everyone. Thank you for coming today and welcome. Um, so as you've seen, the presentation is going to be recorded. We're going to ask that you keep your mics off during the recording and during the presentation. Um, there will be time afterwards for questions where you'll be able to turn on, but for the meantime, just have them off. You're free to keep your cameras on or off according to what you're comfortable with. So yeah, we'll start today with a land acknowledgement. So Bishop's University is located on traditional and unceded territory of the Abenaki people. And also, like, as educators, we really have a responsibility to reflect on our role on Indigenous realities because of the past failures of the Canadian education system. So I'll invite you to take a moment to think of why you're here today and your future as an educator or your current, like your present as an educator and what you can do for the Indigenous communities. I'll also invite anyone who is from another area to maybe they want to do their own land acknowledgement in the chat. There doesn't seem to be any other land acknowledgements, so I'll move on to kind of the agenda for today. Our guest speaker is Robert Couture-Matte from University Laval, who will be discussing using virtual reality in the language classroom, a task-based virtual journey. The presentation should last about 20 to 25 minutes. We ask that during the presentation, you can submit your questions through the chat, and at the end, we will have a time to answer any questions that we can. Like I mentioned earlier, it is recorded, so whether or not you have your camera on is up to you, but we do ask that the mics stay off. So these webinars are a part of the REEAL project. So I'll introduce a little bit what this group aims. So we aim to generate new ideas in thinking, doing, and being as teachers. And the idea is to create a resource for educators, which will be found on the website. The website, it should have been linked on the posters that you received, and we can also look it up online. It's just the For Real project. And so for the rest, I'll leave Monica to introduce our speaker.
So thank you so much, Emily, for the introduction, and thank you, Robin Couture-Matte, to be our speaker today. Robin is a sessional lecturer and a PhD candidate at Université Laval. He's also a licensed teacher of English as a second language in Quebec. He specializes in the use of digital games, virtual reality, and immersive technologies as harnessed for language learning. His research aims to promote the use of digital games and virtual reality in the context of task-based learning with young language learners. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Robin to share his teaching strategies with us.
All right, so welcome everyone. So let me share my screen there and we can get started. All right, excellent. If anything, let me know, and I think you can see my presentation very well. Okay, so welcome. So first, just a general welcome to this short presentation on virtual reality. As Professor Lau said, or Sunny said, my name is Robert Couture-Matte. That hasn't changed in 5 minutes. It's still the same. And I'm a sessional lecturer. I'm a doctoral student too. So this presentation today is, a part of it is actually my thesis. So it's part of the work I do with students as my doctoral thesis. And I'm also an ESL teacher. So a lot of the projects I'll be showing you today, I've actually done with some of my colleagues in primary and high schools here in the Quebec region. I'm actually part of 3 different school boards. I I've had the opportunity to move around the Quebec region in the past few years, and I'm now part of so many different school boards. And this is why I got to do some amazing VR projects with different teachers. So what are we going to do today? So basically, first, my objective is to introduce you to the idea of high immersive virtual reality. So what is it? What does it do? How can we use it for language learning? And that's why we'll discuss the affordances of HVR. So what can we do with it in the classroom? What does the research say about it? And we'll then continue with 4 projects that I had the opportunity to carry out in schools. And maybe that will give you an idea of how we were able to use some of this amazing tech with students to learn English. And then I will discuss quickly the challenges and future opportunities for using VR in your school. So today's not a sales pitch, but in a way it is. I hope that by the end of this presentation, you'll be super excited about VR, so you can even try it with your own students, or maybe encourage other teachers to give it a try. So what is high immersive virtual reality? Well, let's start with what is virtual reality. Virtual reality really is the idea that we replicate an environment virtually so that people, the users, can be present, usually through an avatar or some sort of virtual being in a way, and interact within that environment. This can range from just playing little games on your cell phone, for example. Sometimes we see, or even you do it yourself, you play small games like Angry Bird, where you're a bird basically, and you're being shot through different things. You're in a virtual environment, all the way to something more immersive, such as a virtual reality headset. So in research, we see that VR is quite large. But there's a distinction between VR and HVR, or high immersive virtual reality. And the idea of high immersive virtual reality is that it's the highest level of immersion we have right now, which is a head-mounted device, such as the one that the person here wears on the screen, that entirely blocks your view, and generally there's some headsets, and you interact with controllers so that you feel almost completely immersed into that virtual world. So VR in itself is a very large term, but today we'll be talking about HVR, which is really the use of those headsets that you see out there, at Best Buy, that you can buy for Christmas or, try at your home. And really, my research as a PhD student has been focused on HVR, on high immersive virtual reality. So all the examples that I will present today were carried out with students, were projects with students who had those headsets on, basically, and they had to carry out tasks with the headsets, usually in teams. So why? So when we talk about HVR, we talk about head-mounted displays. We usually call them HMDs. So if you read some literature about virtual reality, you'll often see the term HMD, which is basically the headset. And when you go out to schools, you might encounter 3 types of headsets. Okay, you might encounter what we call phone-based headsets, which are usually they're made of cardboard or very simple plastic. And the idea is that your telephone actually becomes the VR. I don't have one with me today, but your telephone gets into the headset, and the whole computing machine is your telephone, and it projects, a picture which is split in 2 and then goes through very simple lenses, which then create this 360 effect as you're moving around with your telephone. Okay, this is like the most basic, if you will, HMD. Often in schools, that's what they have because it's very cheap. You can get like a cardboard version for $20. Your students usually have their own phones, and it works with pretty much all the phones. So that's one option that you might encounter in schools. The other option is the standalone. I call it standalone, but there might be other terms, such as this one, the Meta Quest 2. This one, everything is included in the machine. The computer is in there, so all you need to do is plug it in. a few, every now and then so that the battery is charged, and you just have to put it on and you can navigate in the virtual world. So everything is included in there, and that's what I use for my PhD studies, because unlike the phone-based one, the quality is much higher. Okay, and we can do we have access to better applications with this one, and usually you have some controllers so you can navigate inside the world. This one is not very common in schools. I haven't seen a lot of schools who have the standalone one because they're a bit more expensive. But I think as we progress, this is where the whole VR, evolution will go to. And there's a third one, which is computer powered. Usually they're a bit more expensive and they require an external computer to work. I've seen some schools, very advanced schools with advanced technology, who have those. But they're very expensive. They're of much higher quality generally. And so maybe in your school system, in your school board, you might have like a dedicated room for those headsets, but they require very expensive machines. And I've seen a few, like in one of my school boards here, there's a special place just for that we can reserve as teachers so that we can go out there. But they're less and less popular because now we have those standalone, which we can just move around. It's battery powered and it works very well. So a quick introduction to HMDs, because you might encounter all three as you're out in schools. Now, let's say you want a nice Christmas present, because Christmas is coming, and you want to buy one of those because you want to try it on your own. I suggest either the phone-based if you don't have a big budget, or the standalone, which is relatively affordable for a family. Okay, so usually you can give it a try, and that's what I would recommend, such as the Meta Quest 2, which I have right here with me. Okay, so why use high immersive virtual reality? So why do we use it? What's the whole research, the whole concept behind it? Well, it's three things. First, the idea is that it's really enhanced immersion. By being, in the virtual world, by having almost all the senses blocked and dedicated to that virtual world, we feel that our students feel like they're there, and it really creates this immersion like being there. So it's kind of bringing other places to the classroom. Imagine like you're going on a field trip. You'd like to visit London, for example, with your students who are learning English. It would be a beautiful place, right? Well, instead of paying airplane tickets and hotels, which are very expensive, students could visit London using the headset and feel a bit like they're there, because they can see all around and hear the sounds at the same time, and even sometimes move with the controllers. So that's really the first advantage. The second advantage is real world connections, because as students are in this virtual world and they feel in there, we call that the sense of presence, they're usually able to interact with some virtual objects. So imagine that you're creating a situation where your students are in a virtual restaurant and they get to manipulate some of the items, like food or plates and cutlery. So it creates a real world connection in the sense that they feel as if they're in the real world and they're handling actual objects. Okay, and this ties in with the idea of extended cognition. So the researchers, what they found is, and what they're trying to prove really as part of this, is that by being there, by being immersed, by having these real world connections and interactions, our brains, our cognition works better, and we tend to assimilate, the learning a bit better, because we feel like our body is part of the experience. It's an embodied experience. So that's the whole idea behind HVR. And there's a lot of research in the past few years that have tried to, develop this idea of bringing immersion to the classroom to enhance learning. So in what context can one use high immersive virtual reality? Well, and this is again based on different projects that have been going around the world. What we see is that a lot of researchers have actually used it for writing. Maybe it sounds weird for you in your mind, but basically the idea is that by being immersed in a virtual environment, first it can help with, for example, calligraphy, okay, because you can move around, try different things, and follow a pattern which is given to you. But also, it can inspire your writing because you feel like you're there. So imagine if you ask your students to write a story, and that's one of the projects that we did. You have to write a story as if you were in London. I'm going to take the London example again. Well, if you just give them a few pictures and watch a few videos, well, they do have some content, sure, but they don't feel as if they've been there. But let's say you have them watch that a 360 video where they feel they can look around, have all this experience, then usually it makes for much richer writing. So that's one of the aspects. Another one is pronunciation. Some of the applications we have in VR, they actually react to the learner's pronunciation. One of them, for example, is Monthly VR, where you get to interact with the machine and practice pronunciation, and then the machine reacts in a situation like, let's say you're taking a taxi, okay? And then the taxi driver asks you some questions, and then you have to answer, and it reacts depending on how you answer and how well you pronounce or not. So one of them is pronunciation. Another one is reading, because imagine again for the London example, you could have your students read a text about London with a nice picture at the top. That would be fine. But some of the applications out there, as you're walking around London in virtual reality, you have some bubbles that pop up with text that explains the different parts of London, the different buildings. So it becomes a reading exercise, which is really ingrained into the whole immersive experience. So it makes everything like a bit better in this way. Another one is interaction for two things. The first thing is, as students are navigating some virtual worlds and are being immersed, if they're working in teams, it makes everything more tangible. So when you're asking them to carry out tasks, and when students, for example, have to find an object, they have to communicate, they have to interact as they're moving around a virtual world, exactly as if they had, for example, to move around an actual city, okay? In one of the projects I'll show you, the students, they had to move around an enchanted forest, for example. Well, they had to communicate. Okay, where do we go? Oh, that's a tree. Okay, let's go right to the tree. Let's move there. Let's do that. They didn't have a choice because they were as if they were in the environment itself. A second thing too is this: these HMDs, they're online, and a lot of the applications, such as AltSpace VR, gives you access to communication with native speakers anywhere in the world. Usually a lot of people from the US, for example. I remember an experience where I was with students and we had them go online and they were communicating with people from Kentucky, from other places in the US, and they were in a virtual environment as if they were with the people communicating, talking about the things that happened there, all in VR. So it really creates an amazing place for interaction, okay? And the last one is vocab, or vocabulary. I'm sure you understand. And that a lot of the studies that have been carried out are about vocabulary, because as students are handling different parts of the virtual world, at some point they're bound to have to learn some vocabulary to be able to carry out those tasks. So a lot of the research is around vocabulary too. So as you can see, because it's creating an entirely different environment virtually, it can lead to so many different skills and to so many different tasks that can be created around those. So to exemplify this, I will tell you about 4 little projects that I carried out with teachers here in the Quebec region, okay? So the first one is a writing project. And basically we had, we had 4 groups of secondary 2 students, so basically age 13, 14, maybe a little bit older, were in enriched ESL, and they had to write fairy tales, modern fairy tales, with an imposed setting. What I mean by an imposed setting is we wanted the students to write fairy tales and to actually understand the place where this fairy tale took place, basically. So what we did is we had the students watch some 360 videos that I selected, okay, with different places in the world. And you can see them here on the right. This is a screenshot from my YouTube channel dedicated to VR. So for example, okay, New York City, Times Square. So the students had to watch a 360 video. So they were as if they were in Times Square looking around. You know, people would walk by. You would have had some noises added to that because it's VR. And students had to take notes and really feel the place and take notes on their impressions, on the emotions they felt, as if they were in the place. Something which would be a bit more difficult to do if they were simply, for example, reading a book or watching a YouTube video, which is not virtual reality. And then they had to write a fairy tale based on that setting and the notes that they took. And what we saw is first, the students were really, really engaged because they had watched the video. They felt as if they were in the place. They felt as if they made the fairy tale their own. And the writing was much more personal. We could see all the words, all the emotions, all the concept that they had felt in the 360 video because they felt as if they were there, transpired onto the writing that they had to do. So that's one of the approaches that we see a lot in research, and we tried it too, and it worked very well. Students were really excited about this project, and they had fun. And you can see here on the right, we really had a plethora of different places they could visit. We had Seoul, for example, we had a palace, we had Venice, the canals. They really loved the canals, and they could choose one of those settings for their fairy tales. A second project that we carried out is with younger students. This time it was with grade 6 students in an intensive ESL program. We had about 6 groups again. And the idea here was to see if VR could create an emotional impact, which would help in communication. So what we did is students had to visit virtually the International Space Station using the Mission ISS application. So basically, and I'll show you a short video in a few seconds about this application, okay, which is great every time. In the application, students, they're weightless. I know it sounds weird, but they're weightless in the sense that their avatar doesn't have gravity. So they need to use the controllers as thrusters, and it kind of changes their entire brain, okay? And I've had students who, like, I could see that their body reacted differently because all of a sudden, all the stimuli was no longer based on gravity. It was based on having no gravity, basically. And what they had to do, there were a few in the ISS, and they had to find different objects. And we wanted to see if just having to find objects in a new environment, being weightless, would foster communication between students, so they would interact. What we found is students interacted at levels that we had never seen in that class, just because they were geared to finding those objects and handling the new environment, and they were really highly motivated. And just a simple task, finding objects in a space station in VR, really created a lot of interaction with them. So I'll just get out of my PowerPoint for a second, and I'll show you a short video, a few seconds, of what it looks like a bit in the application. Okay. Tell me if you see the if you hear the sound. Okay, Sunny.
Yeah.
I think I.
Yes, we
You
can
hear?
hear it.
Only
Perfect.
a handful of people know
So,
what it's like to be an astronaut.
It's a bit like that. So you see, you're floating in space. Everything floats around you, and it's really a new experience.
To work, learn, and live in space.
Yeah.
You can be one of them.
Okay. So this was just a few seconds from my from a video, but it exemplifies very well what happened during the actual application. Students would float around like this, and they would see all these objects floating around them, and they would move without even moving themselves because they were floating in the atmosphere. And this created really a new perspective for them. So the third example was with secondary 3 students, 2 and 3 in high school. And for this one, there was a whole cultural component to it. So basically, we had 6 groups of PI students, okay? They were secondary 2, I think. And Students, they were in a project where they had to do some things about the Shoah. Okay, that was the whole project. They had to write a text, read some books. And we decided to have, as part of the project, an experience about the Anne Frank house. Are you familiar with Anne Frank? Does that ring a bell? You know, she wrote a diary because she was hiding during World War II. And basically, there's a museum in the Netherlands. And during the pandemic, the museum decided to go online and to recreate the whole house in VR. So if you have the Meta Quest 2, for example, this one, you can go online and visit the house, move around the house as if you were there. And so what they had to do is they were in teams of 4, and this was one of the earlier projects that we did. And one student in the team would have the headset on and was visiting one of the rooms in the house, and he or she would have to describe the room to the other students who were taking notes. And then they would switch like that, so everybody would have one room to visit. It took about 20 minutes as a group of 4 to do all 4 rooms that we wanted them to visit. And then they would go back, they would share their observations, share their feelings. How did they feel? How were the different rooms? And then they had to write some captions with pictures to describe what they had seen. And that was part of their project. And what we saw is, and this project had been going on for a few years with a teacher, and what she saw, the difference she saw that year because of the VR is that students were really into the project. They really wanted to share their impressions because of what they saw in VR, and they collaborated much more together in writing the captions because of what they felt with the VR. And while they were visiting the house and taking notes, interaction was very high. And for this one, I'm lucky I got permission to film the students. And, it's not always possible, but for this one. And I have 15 seconds to show you. So I'm going to make it big. So before we start, this is the setup of the class. Okay, so basically I had 2 teams at a time. And you can see we had 2 people wearing the headsets. And then the other members of the team are taking notes. So I'll just let you judge for yourself. So that's it. So it was really short. But did you notice what one of the students, what happened there? Maybe it was too quick. But one of the students actually said, oh, there's a tunnel. She didn't know what the word was. And then she started asking questions to her peers, and then they worked together to find out what the object in the virtual world was. Many situations like that actually happened while they were discussing, because they were so into trying to describe the house and so forth. And here to the left, you can see the worksheet that they had to complete. So you see something very simple like that just created a lot of interaction, and students were highly motivated. Okay, I'm going to move quickly. I'm sorry, the time is running fast. So the 4th example is for younger students again, grade 6 intensive. This one is partly part of my thesis. So basically what students had to do is, it was part of a vocabulary development project. We had many students, okay? So this was done partly for my thesis, partly for other groups. And they played a game called Rec Room, okay, where it's a virtual environment for kids, for children, and there's different games, different environments really meant for children. There's also a whole system to make sure that children are not, that there's a security system in place to make sure that it's children appropriate, which was great for our study. And so what students had to do is they had to describe the playful virtual environment. So they had to explore the place, describe certain things. So in a way, the VR itself kind of became the text that they had to deal with, and they had to react to, and they had some comprehension questions. So they had to find different objects. They had to find different things in the Rec Room application. And what we found is 2 things. First, of course, students interacted a lot because they were together in the world, and they had to find different objects. They had to find different things, but also high levels of focus on form. For those of you who are maybe a little less familiar with the concept, the idea here is that because of the task that they had to carry out, students' attention was brought to gaps in their knowledge, gaps in what they were saying, because they didn't know a word for a thing or how to say something, and they would ask, they would get help either from me or from their peers, and that would help them really use that language much more in the context of the task. What we found is that the environment was so rich that it created a lot of focus on form and interaction based on that. And here you can see the little worksheet that they had to complete. You know, what is the decoration? What are the sports activities that you can do here? What are the objects that you can see? Very simple, and they would put on the headset, you know, and then come back and take some notes and then go back. And they would work in teams like that. Okay. So I just finished talking about my 4 little projects. I'm sure now you have a better idea of what we did in the classroom. I would like to conclude by discussing some of the challenges that we had, because it might look great to do VR, and I think it is. I'm going to continue doing it. You know, I'm also a sub teacher in school, and I usually bring my VR and we do it with kids, and it's always great. But there are some challenges, so you need to know what you're getting into. The first thing is students sometimes, and even yourself, if you're doing VR, if you're doing it for too long, you might get discomfort. Okay, because you're wearing a headset, which is, you know, it's not that heavy, but it's not light neither. You know, there's a whole computer in there. So my recommendation for this would be keep the experiences relatively short, usually under 10 minutes, because beyond that, students tend to, you know, have headaches or maybe their heads or something like that. So the second thing too, what I say by lessened interaction is, you need to consider the fact that when students are in the VR, they can't really hear you or see you. And it's a little harder for them to deal with paper tasks. So you need to really think about this. I know it sounds basic, but you know, if your students are all wearing VR, you cannot give them a sheet that they have to answer on because they're all in VR. So this needs to be considered. One of the solutions that we found is to have students work in teams of 2, and they would alternate and communicate. So one of them would complete the worksheet while the other one's in VR. Then at some point they switch places and continue like that. That's what I did, for example, for my PhD study. So one of the solutions, but it needs to be considered. And you need also to consider the hardware. I know I've said this before, but some of this equipment is quite expensive. You know, for example, the Meta Quest that I have here is several $100s. Okay, so you need to consider what kind of hardware do you have. Like, do you have enough money to buy maybe more phone-based headsets, which would be easier to handle, or do you want to buy maybe 1 or 2 more powerful headsets and have your students use them as a workshop at the end of the class or something like that? There's different possibilities, and you need to get acquainted with the hardware because it's always a little tricky sometimes, especially at first. So my recommendation would be to buy one for yourself or to get one with the school and then try it on your own several times before you actually plan something with your students. So little challenges to make sure that you traps you don't fall into for such projects. But there are great things coming really for VR, and what I mean here by future opportunities is really trying to sell you the thing even more. First, I think headsets are now more than accessible, okay, for anyone. A few years ago, it was difficult to get affordable headsets. It was difficult to try them on. You know, it was really new, but now it's much easier to buy headsets, and they're available, and they're not cheaper, but they're not as expensive as they used to be. So really, this is something very encouraging for us as teachers. Also, there's really great new applications coming out, especially for language learning. For example, there's a whole project called the Immerse Me project, where they try to create this amazing VR platform for language learning, where you can create situations, you can create tasks, you can even have the teacher in there with a board. So there's different new projects. And also, students are getting used to using VR. Okay, so a lot of them have VR at home, and it's becoming part of our culture. So if you feel maybe afraid that you don't have enough experience with VR, there's probably someone in your class who has experience and who can help you out amongst your students. And finally, more research proves its impact. So research is really coming out. So sometimes it's hard to justify buying VR headsets for the school, or maybe you're not sure if it works. I can assure you that the studies that have been coming out really show that it can be an asset to the language classroom. So I encourage you to try it for yourself. So that's it. Do you have any questions today for me?
Thank you so much, Robin. Thank you so
You're
much.
welcome.
It's so interesting. I'm sure we have a lot of questions.
I think I'll stop sharing my screen so I can see people. Is that, yeah? Okay.
Many people wrote on the chat that, for example, Philippa says she was a bit skeptical at the beginning, but after hearing the projects that you have done, we were quite convinced.
Sure.
Maybe I'll start first. I really like the descriptive writing and also the creative writing project because it makes sense. Because being able to be immersed in the environment and having all the senses, it really helps students to come up with ideas. And I think what a great idea. I wonder if there are, so all these are depending on the software or programs that you use. So they're already ready-made programs that you can tap into.
So all the projects I told you about today are all with free software that you can get if you have the headset. For example, and this is a big, this is a good point, because, for example, I own 4 different headsets. Buying the same software 4 times would be quite expensive. So I make sure that I have some free software because a lot of these experiences are free online. So, for example, the writing project is actually YouTube. It's called YouTube VR. So YouTube has different 360 videos that you can find online. You could even try with your phone if you wanted to. It's free, and it's access to the Meta Quest 2. So we use YouTube basically.
Okay, thank you. I can see Monica's hands up and then Genevieve.
Thanks. I have a million questions, but I'll try to keep it brief. I guess just based on what you were just saying, Robin, about how there are all these different resources. Is there like a textbook or a place where a lot of these resources are sort of brought together so that a newbie would know where to start looking, or is it kind of you have to start exploring?
There are a few websites online that I've tried to compile, applications for learning, but it's still something quite new. So I wouldn't say that there's one amazing reference that I would, I don't have like a textbook. I would love if you find one, please tell me. So
No, you're gonna write one. You're gonna write one. That's it. Think beyond the PhD, man. You're gonna write one.
If there's one, I don't know about it yet, and it's probably just come out. But there's different websites where you can find. If you tap like VR education, VR language learning, there's a few websites where you can get ideas with applications. Absolutely.
Okay. So that wasn't my real question. That was just like riffing off the previous comment of where can we find all this great stuff. But I guess my question, I noticed the youngest learners you work with were grade 6, and I'm sure that there are some I'm imagining there are some age-related classroom management issues using tech. So my question would be, do you think it could be used with even younger learners? And if yes, no, what would be the pitfalls there?
So what I would say is I think so. I think younger learners could do it. I mean, I've done it with friends who have 6-year-old children with no any problem. We use it with intensive English because they have a lot of time with their students in the class. I feel like regular teachers who see their students twice, 3 times a cycle, it would be doable, but at the same time, it would be a little harder, I think, to manage time because it takes quite a while to go through a whole group. It only like I only had 4 headsets, so going through everyone took a little more time. So I think it would be harder for them.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks, Robin.
No problem.
Genevieve and then Emily.
I had the same question as Monica, so you already answered my question. Thanks.
That's it. No problem. This being said, 1 second. I've actually done it with grade 4, but not. I was replacing a homeroom teacher though. It was not in English, and they were more than capable of handling the whole thing and going online. So I would definitely do it if I were teaching at that level. Yes, Emily. Sorry.
No problem. I wonder if with HPR, like, with the neurodiverse students, sometimes it can be like they learn in a different way. Do you think with HPR you could have some apps to help them learn and stuff?
Oh, you mean I guess I don't know the apps that are really for language learning though, and that's one of the downfalls of I know there are apps that are coming out that could help students like that, and I'm not much aware for other challenges that students might have, but I definitely see it in the future. Of course, I think that students could get a lot of help and scaffolding from VR. Unfortunately, I don't know of any applications right now for that specific purpose. But it's a great idea.
Eunice. Oh, your hand up.
Yes. Hi, Robin. Thank you so much for the presentation. It's very insightful. And I was just discussing with Sunny earlier that my classmates and my classmate and I, actually, Karina, she's sitting right next to me.
Hello.
We were discussing the possibility of the classroom in a post-COVID world, the classroom evolving to exclusively a virtual classroom, a virtual environment, which would obviously entail some logistical challenges, but and especially in Quebec, being a place where the video game and the engineering and coding and all that stuff is very popular here, and it's actually probably one of the leading places in that domain. Do you feel like Quebec would be a place where maybe we could build that kind of future where education or the classroom would be completely exclusively virtual?
In the distant future, probably yes. I mean, I see it at some point. This being said, the technology we have right now is still, it's hard to use VR for long periods of time. I don't know who wrote a little comment, but someone, I think it's Professor Philippa Parks, who said that she got seasick after 3 minutes. And so maybe if the technology evolves so that it becomes physically possible, because right now and I see that for young students, it's generally better. Like they're not seasick as quickly as older students, and that's just my personal observation. But right now we're limited by our bodies actually, and how we handle all this virtual input. This being said, I think so in the future, and projects like Immerse Me, I'm not even sure there's a lot of pages online about that. That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to create a virtual environment where the teacher and the students could do the entire class in virtual reality, and and all the tools would be there. So I see it in the future at some point, especially for language learning.
Good, thank you.
Yeah.
Wait, you're not.
Like it was mentioned, students can't really spend a lot of time on the VR at once. So do you think with big classes that would be that would be something good, like that they can't spend a lot of time on it since more students can use it?
Yes, all the projects I've done are with bigger classes, and it's a good thing because after 5 or 10 minutes, usually they want to stop on their own because they're like, okay, that's enough, which makes it easy for us to justify shorter experiences, you know, where students, like you said, where students get to rotate and use the headset, you know, and pass it around. So absolutely, it makes it easier for us because otherwise they would probably want to spend the whole period, you know, wearing the headset.
It could compensate for the lack of headsets, basically, since more
Yes.
students are able to use it.
And from a practical standpoint, you know, headsets like these, they require still some knowledge of how they work and to make sure that there's some troubleshooting sometimes. So I wouldn't recommend like having 26 for a class of 26. What I really suggest and what we've been doing is more like a workshop. So basically students, you know, sometimes students have stations, you know, like you have 6 stations in the class, they're in teams of 4. Then one of the stations could easily be VR. So this way, if something happened, you could either ask a student who's an expert to be there and help the others, or if there's something, it's only 2 students or 4 students that you have to go and help. I think the technology is great, but it's still evolving. And maybe at some point, like computers, we'll be able to just give the VR headsets to everyone and say, like, go online and have fun. But right now, it still requires some knowledge. It still requires some technicalities that need to be learned to be used well, which is why I think it's better, like you said, if we keep it small for now in the classroom. Yes. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Emily?
Yeah, I had a question. I was wondering, could VR, like HVR, be paired with like actual physical real life tasks? Or is it better to just exclusively have the VR?
What do you mean by actual physical task? Do you have an example in mind?
Well, one idea was, let's say in the virtual world, there are different objects around in front of them. In the real world, they could also have those objects placed with them. Or maybe another idea would be a classroom where half of it is doing the VR task, and then the other half is doing another task that's still on the same subject, but they're in groups and working in the real world instead of working with the VR.
I understand. So there's actually 2 things in your question. The first thing is right now it's evolving, and with MetaQuest 2, we can more and more use our hands as our controllers, which is great. But it's not the case for all applications. We still need to use controllers. You know, so handling physical objects with controllers it's just not possible. But I know some places where they have like VR dedicated rooms with physical, you know, obstacles that are worked into the software so that people can actually move around and so forth. I don't know if that would be possible in a classroom, perhaps in the future, but for now we are kind of limited by the fact that we have controllers and that our classrooms are not that large generally. So that's the first thing. The second thing, the second question concerning, you know, students doing something in the classroom, probably there's ways to have tasks which include both. One of the ways that we've done this is there are easy ways that we can test what's going on in the headset on an external device. Let me explain. So let's say, for example, that I'm a student with Professor Monica Waterhouse, and she's wearing the headset. Well, I could have my cell phone, and then what she sees on the headset, I see on my cell phone. So she's casting what she sees on the, so I can see what she's doing, so I can interact with her, guide her with a map, let's say, for example, okay? And this, I didn't get into that, but in my PhD project, that's what students did. They had tasks that they had to complete on paper, and then they could see what the other person could see, and then they were interacting this way. So it kind of became a dual activity. So it's closer to what you were suggesting.
Yeah, that's what I had in mind. Thank you.
No problem. No problem.
Monica.
Yes.
Hey, Robin, just a quick question and then a comment. Are you presenting this at the Speak convention in November? I'm curious.
I'm presenting a VR project at the Speak,
Okay.
but it's not the same presentation at all.
No, okay. Interesting. So I guess if some of us are going to be in Lévis, I don't know about those further afield, but Marion might be there. Philippa Parks is going to be there. So you may get to meet Robin in person.
Yeah, one of the projects I touched on today, it's related to that. So it's going to be much more in depth, which today was like I went over things very quickly. But at Speak, it's going to be more in depth with one of the projects that we did.
Good. So I'm being saleswoman for your work as well there.
Thank
So
you.
don't miss his workshop at Speak. The other thing I wanted to ask, well, it's more of a comment, and I don't know if you can speak to it, Robin, but
Sure.
And it's my critical educator bit when you were, and I think I probably brought this up last year when we talked about your project with Alexa as well, with the pronunciation aspect.
Correct.
And I always get a little nervous when softwares are deciding if my pronunciation is good enough.
Yeah.
Because there's a whole critical literature around comprehensibility, and that's really challenging some of the older ideas around accent reduction pedagogies and really challenging this notion that there's only one right way to sound like a native speaker, whatever that is. So I guess my comment is just that I'm a little nervous about the pronunciation application, particularly if it wasn't created by a critical educator who's got that in the back of their mind. So I guess my question would be like, do you know anything about that, and how on spot do you have to be for these pronunciation apps to recognize you?
Actually, one of my first experiences when I bought a first VR headset 6 years ago was with a pronunciation software called Monly VR, which has evolved a bit since then. And the situation I described earlier, like I was in a taxi, and then they were asking me questions like, "Where do you want to go?" Like blah blah blah. I mean, my level of English has evolved over the years, but it was still pretty good 6 years ago. And some of the things that they told me, like I realized that the technology just wasn't there yet. This being said, this whole intelligent personal assistance, you know, the idea of using your voice has evolved tremendously over the past few years. What we do now with Siri, with Alexa, with Google Home, and by extension in VR is much better now than it used to be. So I understand your reservations. You're like, okay, what's going on? But it's much better now. So I feel in the future we might get to something which is much more easy to use for a language classroom. This being said, most of the projects that are going on right now, they're really either peer-peer interaction or teacher-student interaction because of such constraints. So,
right on. Thanks, Robin.
No problem. Yeah, exactly. Ms. Brisson said that. Okay.
Thank you, Monica, for raising that question. Do we have any questions from the audience? Bianca.
Earlier you talked about students being able to reach students from across the world, or like, I think you said Kentucky. Right?
Yeah, the people we met were from Kentucky, correct.
Were they also students, or were they just random people from Kentucky?
No, and that was at the time when we did this project, and I didn't mention it because it was kind of a, spur of the moment, and we didn't realize that. But right now, if I were to redo the same thing, I would need permission from the school because we don't know who's out there. Okay, and what happened is back then I went to a school here in Lévis, taught a teacher. We got super excited, and then we had some students go online, and try to speak with people, and it went well. We didn't have any problems, but right now we realize the whole ethical aspect of doing this. So in applications such as Rec Room, for example, one of the last ones I showed you, there is a whole system in place to make sure that it's meant for children. So basically, it's to make sure that students don't, if they use inappropriate language, if someone else uses, they can get kicked out pretty quickly. But the application we used, Outspace VR, back then, anything would have happened. So if I were to do it again, I would get permission, and I would warn and prepare my students. A bit like going on a field trip. Like, you never know. You might go to Toronto, and your students, they have the afternoon where they can do whatever they want. They might encounter people who are using inappropriate language. So it would be the same kind of preparation that way.
Because I think it's really cool to have the opportunity to meet other second language learners. I know that when I was learning Spanish, or I'm still learning, but anyways, it would have been nice to have like a speaking pen pal of sorts that you can meet through virtual reality.
And I haven't done it, but I know some professors here at Laval and in Taiwan are working on tandem exchanges in VR, which would be also a very interesting topic. But they're working with adults. It's a bit easier, but even in high school, I would see it absolutely.
This is actually a very good segue to our next talk, because our next, our next talk on December 6th is 21st Century Second Language Learning, the E-Tandem Approach by Susan Parks. So I hope that you will not miss it. Genevieve, I think maybe the last question.
It's actually not a question, it's a comment, because I think it's out of the scope of this presentation, but I'd love to hear about your theoretical framework and how you're analyzing your data and stuff. So it'd be really interesting. I don't know, are you working with Monica? Is Monica your supervisor? No, okay, because I was going to ask you some questions about your theoretical framework, but we can do that when we meet in person with a drink or something at some point.
Oh, so. I would love to. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Because it would be really interesting to look at how that thing that you're interacting with, how this affects your learning and everything. There's so much with how you use it as a teacher, but how you do it as a researcher is super interesting as well.
Yeah. I imagine too, the soutenance will be taking place in the next year or so once we all go through reading, because I'm on the committee, so I'll be reading it, but it's my colleague Susan Parks. But I'm sure we can keep you apprised of the soutenance, and if it's virtual, it's easy to join in, and if it's in person, who knows?
Quebec is not that far.
Weekend in Quebec. I have a guest room, Geneviève. I have a guest room for you.
I'd be interested.
Me too.
Yeah, I have one guest room.
How about
I have one guest
a date party at Monica's house when you do your soutenance?
Okay, I'll start planning.
Thank you. The presentation was super interesting, and I think there's so many things interesting for teacher in there, and I like how you presented it in a very nuanced way. Like, it's not let's just go all in and this is what's going to solve every problem, but I think there's a great affordances, and how you presented it was super great. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
And definitely I can see a lot of potential, and I immediately link it to social materialism. I don't know if you're using that theory, but I think it is really, really great. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for coming today. And thank you once again, Robin, for your great presentation. We look forward to future conversations.
Yes, thank you for listening to me, and good luck with your VR endeavors.